Okay, I'm just going to very quickly just introduce the theme for our symposium, and I imagine, as usual, people will come in. But our symposium this year, as we have talked about it, or mentioned in chapel this morning, as you've seen all over campuses, drawn from Jesus' admonition to us, when did I see you hungry, or when did we see you hungry? And it's about advocacy, hunger, and faithful citizenship. We want to explore the role of civil society, particularly the role of citizens to influence government. Given what has happened, especially in the last few years since the global recession began in 2008, escalating food prices worldwide, increasing vulnerability, deepening hunger in many strategic places. It's also been the precipitator of significant movements for change around the world, including throughout much of the Middle East. When I was in South Africa this summer and in East Africa, they kept talking about, we're going to have our African spring, just you wait. And it may be happening now in places like Senegal. Through the plenary and other events, we want to explore the importance of domestic and international civil engagement, what we can do to try to address this. David Beckman, who is our special guest, made a point in his book that just was published. He said, we are at a pivotal point in the history of poverty. Economic turmoil has driven many more people into hunger and poverty, but the clear need for national change and increasingly significant movement against hunger and poverty, voter attitudes, and the commitments of our current president give us a political opening. We may be able to achieve policy changes that will help people in need and set a path towards ending hunger and poverty. At a minimum, faith-grounded activists can make the future better for hungry people than it would be otherwise. So we welcome you this afternoon and this evening and tomorrow to as many events as you can possibly join us for. If you don't have a schedule, there are plenty of these little cards right outside the door. Take another one. We'll have several panels and two panels and two breakout sessions this afternoon, followed by the plenary this evening and two fascinating panels tomorrow morning. So welcome. How many alumni are here today of the Hunger Program Specific? Stand up, all of you guys. Hey. Welcome. We're going to do this again tonight, but thank you. Well, welcome back. All right, Ryan.
All right, well, we're glad all of you folks could join us this afternoon. And we're thankful to Reverend David Beckman for his chapel address, which I think is a really good introduction to our first panel here this afternoon. What I would like to do at this time is we're going to take about a first half hour or so, and we're going to have a couple panel questions and maybe some conversation up here related to advocacy. What is it? What does it mean theologically, biblically to be engaged in advocacy and being a citizen, an active citizen? So we've got three folks up here that are going to help us think through this. I'm the assistant director of the Hunger Program. We'll be moderating. Let me quickly introduce also our other three panelists. Adam Sawyer, to my right, is a senior this year at Wheaton, Hunger student, just returned from Tegucigalpa, Honduras, where he was involved with a human rights and advocacy organization called Association for a More Just Society. He was involved there in land rights and did his independent study project on evaluating a 2004 Ley de Propiedad, which is a property law passed in 2004. And Adam reigns from Denver, Colorado, and is an international relations major. So welcome, Adam. Next to Adam is Ben Lowe. Ben Lowe is the Director of Young Adult Ministries for the Evangelical Environmental Network and the author of Green Revolution, Coming Together to Care for Creation, on InterVarsity Press. Born and raised in Singapore, Ben is a 2007 graduate of Wheaton College and now lives among refugees and immigrants as part of the Parkside Intentional Community in Glen Ellen, Illinois. In 2010, he ran an upstart campaign as the Democratic nominee for U.S. Congress in the Illinois 6th District. And before this, he served as the National Coordinator of Renewal as an outreach director for Arasha USA, an environmental organization. And then next to Ben is Professor Dr. Gary Burge. Dr. Burge says in his bio that he teaches New Testament at Wheaton. Wants his students to grasp how knowing the unique world of the Middle East and antiquity shapes how we read the New Testament today. He was studying in Lebanon at the American University of Beirut in the 1970s when the tragic civil war broke out there, and he was studying politics and Islam, and this has shaped much of his own studies and interests. It seemed that From here, he says, my life found its twin navigational markers, the New Testament and the world of the Middle East. Following graduation from Fuller Seminary in 1978, completed a PhD in New Testament at King's College at Aberdeen University in Scotland. He says, I've had the good fortune of being befriended by many Palestinian Christian pastors and learning with dismay about the suffering of the Palestinian church in modern Israel. In 1993, I wrote a study on this dilemma entitled, Who Are God's People in the Middle East? With Zondervan. I've also become active in an evangelical advocacy group, Evangelicals for Middle East Understanding, which works to facilitate dialogue between Arab and Western church leaders. In 2003, he wrote a second, more thorough volume on Palestine entitled Whose Land, Whose Promise? What Christians Are Not Being Told About Israel and the Palestinians. So let me welcome our panelists. Thanks for joining us. All right. In terms of our theme, let me open with a recently published work by Robert Putnam and David Campbell. They wrote a book recently called American Grace. It was awarded the Best Book of the Year by the American Political Science Association. It's a major study of religion and civic life in America. Putnam is known for noting the importance of associational life or community life to democracy. So in this book, American Grace, he reveals two things. Yes, we are polarized. For many of us, this is not going to be anything new. Religiously, politically polarized, it's a shrinking middle. And young people in particular are disavowing organized religion because of their unease with the close association of the church with conservative politics. Interesting. But that's not new for many of us. What is new and more controversial from what they found is that their claim that religion also unites Americans. When people of different religions know each other, then they're likely to tolerate each other. For this reason, the authors claim that political polarization has driven our religious polarization, not vice versa. Corollary of this is that religion contributes significantly to civic life. Religious Americans, those who engage in regular religious activities, are more civically active, trusting of others, more likely to help an older woman across the street, all of these sorts of things, give blood, give money and time to civic associations. And basically what they say is that the more religious friends you have, the more civically minded you will be. So this is an interesting finding. However, these same religious people are also less supportive of government policies to address the structural causes of poverty. This reveals a very peculiar characteristic of American religion. It means that Americans who regularly attend church are, in a real sense, holding together our civic life, but at the same time, the same people are not advocating for structural changes related to larger issues of poverty and injustice. So Putnam's findings highlight the power of religion to sustain civic life and engagement as citizens. I think he also gives us a good picture of the tension of religion in America, both the challenges and the opportunities that we face as we discuss advocacy and what it means to be a faithful citizen in our country today. Christian Americans are, on the whole, civically engaged and yet unsupportive of government programs to address structural causes of poverty. This gets further complicated when we see that American Christians are engaged in political advocacy around cultural issues like same-sex marriage or abortion, but not on issues related to poverty and injustice. So American Christians are pushing these political solutions to certain identified problems, but not to others. Where's the line? Who put the line there? What categorically sets issues of poverty and injustice apart from these cultural issues? Or is everything basically a political issue at some level? So these are some of the questions maybe we're trying to think about, toss around in some sense. Each person on this panel has been engaged in advocacy on issues that have been relatively unpopular in some way among American evangelicals in recent years. And so let's hear from them about why and what grounds their advocacy. And we'll throw out to each of you, maybe ask for a brief introduction to tell us about your own involvement in advocacy and what led you to get involved in this way. We could start with you, Adam.
All right. My name is Adam Sawyer, and I was in Tegucigalpa, as Ryan said. And I worked on the land rights team within this organization called Association for a More Just Society. And Association for a More Just Society, their mission is to be brave Christian leaders working to ensure justice for the most vulnerable in society. And I want to emphasize brave there, because I think while I was working with these, they're advocates. They really want to be brave, and they're up against a lot of resistance and a lot of violence. There was a lawyer that was killed 5 years ago, not in the land rights team, in one of the other teams, and then in Honduras right now, there's a lot of violence going on. So I think one of the aspects of advocacy that I am beginning to see is that attribute brave, what it means to be a brave Christian. I think advocacy for me is something that I'm still beginning to reflect upon, where I think a lot about power. Where is power appropriate? Is it appropriate? And we'll probably talk about this later, but when is effectiveness desired and good outcomes desired? But when is faithfulness and kind of not disregard, but like we need to be faithful to what the Christian calling is. Those sometimes are not exclusive to one another. They can run parallel, but sometimes they do seem to contradict. And how do we sort that out? So advocacy to me seems to be a good negotiation starting point for me. So that's why I've started to get involved in advocacy. And I trace my starting point to my work with Association for a More Just Society and working with them and learning from the people who do it in Honduras.
My first steps in advocacy actually took place here at Wheaton, where my junior year, I was part of a little group of us that went to Washington, D.C. and met with then Senator Obama to talk to him about climate change from an evangelical standpoint. It was right after former President Litfin signed on to the Evangelical Climate Initiative. And I remember being shocked being in Washington, D.C. in the middle of all this power and all that I've read about and all that I've seen on TV, and just to actually be in front of the White House or be on the steps of the Capitol and I realize this really exists and I can really stand here. And then to go into these offices and see all the people lined up in their suits and with their impressive papers and dossiers and everything, and then to realize all the money that's behind it as well. That was a little intimidating and discouraging as a 21-year-old Christian student from Wheaton here to talk about climate change. Who's going to listen to us? But Senator Obama did listen to us, and I realized something very important then that I think this panel illustrates right now, is that we're all white or mostly white males up here. Not just that, mostly white Christian males up here. We are traditionally the people in this country who hold the cultural power. And so for us, and there are lots of people in this country who don't hold that cultural power. And so for us, advocacy, speaking up on behalf of those whose voices, everybody has a voice. It's a matter of whether their voice gets heard. Speaking up on behalf of for those whose voices don't get heard in society is not something that we do to be charitable. It's actually a responsibility for us because we are the ones who hold that power, and to be in solidarity with the people that I live with now. This is why I ran for Congress. I live in a neighborhood with refugees and immigrants from all around the world. And listening to their problems and walking with them in their challenges as they try to navigate the public aid system, as they try to find and keep jobs, as they deal with abusive employers who can take advantage of them because they don't have documentation and they're struggling in a very broken immigration system, dealing with those issues firsthand, and then going to my elected officials in this district and sharing the stories and asking them, one citizen to another citizen, one Christian brother to another Christian brother, for them to take time to listen to the stories that I'm hearing and to see the problems that I'm seeing. And then what I find their responses are about, if you don't have money in this society, good luck. That's how politics is run these days. And so realizing, wow, we need to step out. We need to do something. I'm part of a generation of Christians that is disillusioned and disaffected by the religious right and the witness of the culture wars and all that stuff. And a lot of us are disengaging. That's not our option. We don't get to disengage. If we disengage, who's going to be on Capitol Hill? The devil's already there. Corruption's already there. Who's going to bring the light? Who's going to bring the salt? That's us. And so that's why I stepped up to run for Congress, not because I thought I was especially good at being a congressman, but I thought, gee, if no one's stepping up, then we're not going to get anywhere, and we need to create a space. This is what I'll end on. Andy Crouch, in his book Culture Making, talks about how you change culture. You don't necessarily change culture by protesting culture, which, sometimes we need to protest culture. That's okay. But the goal then is not necessarily to change it. You change culture by creating viable alternatives, creating a space, creating new culture. And That's what I think we get to do. We have the power here. We get to step up and we get to create new culture. We get to run for Congress. We get to run for city council. We get to meet with our elected officials and share the stories that we're seeing. We get to bring our neighbors in to meet with elected officials so they can hear directly the stories that are happening in the real world. You know, Washington's not the real world, and the more I work with people in Washington, the more I realize that their view of the rest of America is not very accurate all the time. Now, that's a stereotype. There are a lot of people in there who do get it, but it's a hard place to be, and they need to hear our voices so they can understand what's going on the ground.
I really mark it a privilege to be able to sit up here with three men that I admire, Ben, Adam, and Ryan, whose lives and stories I just really look up to and enjoy hearing. I have had the fortunate or unfortunate experience of getting attached to a justice advocacy issue, which is not terribly popular with evangelicals. So there it is. I'm convinced that it's difficult to have a life that is passionate about justice or advocacy if you haven't had a conversion experience. I think you can read books about justice, you can read about advocacy, you can see this at work someplace, but at some point, it seems to me every person that I know who is passionate about some part of the world, some issue in the world, they have had a conversion experience. And if you actually ask them about it, they will be able to tell you that moment when the conversion experience happened. You might think of it as a second conversion. This is after your conversion to Christ. Somehow you have encountered something, seen something, been in the midst of something that it creates a kind of visceral or existential moment for you, and that really the curtains have opened, you've looked backstage, and you said, you know, there's no going back. The stage play isn't going to look the same. And I think for me, that is true. That is true of the whole Palestinian-Israeli conflict. As Ryan said, when I was an undergraduate, I was in Beirut for a year, and the Lebanese Civil War started. And it was really a struggle between the Palestinian refugee camps and the Lebanese army. The catch was that I think I was too young, and I had no guidance to really interpret all of this. It just seemed pretty exciting to see jet bombers, dropping bombs not too close to my dorm, After that, what happened was that I began leading student groups. After I did a PhD and after I started teaching, I was leading student groups around the Middle East, around Israel, really like Wheaton and the Holy Lands. And we sort of pretended really that we were walking through Israel and reconstructing the life of Jesus or the Old Testament or something like that. And there, what happened is that I began to meet Palestinian pastors who were there in the country, and there was a moment really where one of them challenged me and said, Gary, the thing is that you keep coming back to the Holy Land, but actually you've only had one trip. You've only been to the Holy Land once, even though you've been here many times, because what you're doing is you're staying on what he called the pilgrim or tourist trail. And that's a trail which is very predictable, and everybody keeps going back on it. Our Wheaton and the Holy Lands program stays on the trail. And therefore, he said, I dare you to get off the trail and come and live at my house for a week. And it happened to be during the Palestinian First Uprising. So I was there, and I ended up being at his home and had a fairly intense experience. And I remember a moment, which is even hard for me to tell you, because it is a visceral moment, when I was driving back to Jerusalem. And those of you who know Jerusalem, it was on the Nablus Road, southbound, just north of the Damascus Gate. And my taxi was full of Palestinian Christians. And the traffic stopped. I decided I didn't want to wait for the light, so I got out of my car, and I was just standing there in the crowd, and an Israeli squad came up, and they began to just basically harass all the people in the cars. And I was standing right next to my car, full of these students. The backseat was full of medical students, and the soldiers came up and pointed their barrels into the vehicle and reached in and began slapping all the people inside of my car. And I had just been talking to these people, and it was like, what in the world? I had never seen something like that in my entire life. And so I took a picture of it, and the squad saw me take the picture. And they were unhappy about that. And the next thing I know, I've got 4 soldiers all aiming M16s at me, screaming at me. demanding to take my camera, and the whole street stopped. And I think for me, that was an existential moment in which I said, there's a story here not being told. There's something wrong with this entire picture, and everything I'd been told in that 1 week, everything that I had been told in my evangelical context about this conflict had been misrepresented. And so I think what happens is that became for me a conversion experience. And the conversion experience meant that I was willing to tell stories. I was willing to represent another side to this complex conflict. I was willing to read papers, publish books, speak at conferences, and do whatever it took, because I discovered that I was the custodian of a lot of people's stories. And I wanted to represent those back in the church. So I think what for me that meant was, as you can tell, it's a very personal experience that I had, that became a turning point. And I think that turning point continued to feed what happened in the next 10, 20 years of my life. Whenever I talk to people who are committed to justice or advocacy issues, they can tell you they've had a turning point, and that's what fires their passion.
Well, thank you. I think that's actually good words to talk about the advocacy sort of conversion experience at some level. I think that's what each of us up here have been able to share a little bit. Now that for some, maybe theology and belief in Christian faith maybe was the introduction to advocacy. Maybe for others, it's you get involved and you see the need for this, and then you reflect later on the theology and how this all makes sense. So I'd like to ask a question here related to basically how you ground your understanding or involvement biblically, theologically. Dr. Sandra Yorman, in her introduction to a book called Church, State, and Citizen, notes that all Christian traditions place limits on government. They disagree on where the boundaries are, but all appeal to the theological doctrine of the Imago Dei at some level, that we're all created in the image of God. She says, if it is accepted that citizens of a state are made in the image of God, she says, then the protection of basic human rights follows. In your approach to advocacy, what do you see as the biblical or theological basis that guides your involvement as you've thought about it? And how should Christians generally ground their political involvement biblically? And I could throw that one out too, whoever wants to take a stab at it first.
I guess I'll start, and I'll just start. Dr. Burge was my Christian thought teacher, so, and at the beginning of our theology class, we talked about how young adults have to be very careful about doing theology, so be very careful about doing theology. Yeah, it's true.
What book did you read? What was that?
I don't remember what it was called.
Theology.
Theology. Yeah, exactly. ASJ, the big verse for ASJ where I worked was Micah 6:8, he has shown all you people what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. I think that is pretty straightforward. I love to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. And then I've had some reflections while I was in Honduras as I was learning Spanish on Matthew 5:6. Blessed are they who hunger. In English, we frequently translate, blessed are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. In Spanish, it's translated as justicia. Blessed are you who hunger and thirst for justice, for they will be filled. I think that takes it out of that privatized language of righteousness and expands it into justice. I think that's really important for us to think about, and really actually encouraging for me, because sometimes it feels like justice is never filled. So theologically, here's where I come from. Imago Dei, as Ryan was talking about, I think that from the Catholic social teachings, Catholic tradition, that I think really is helpful to ground how we treat other human beings, that God has impressed upon us a part of who he is, and that is something that never goes away, that we always have to treat with respect. Expanding upon that Imago Dei isn't private, but is shared in kind of the Bantu word Ubuntu, like in African theology, the idea that we are our identity, our individual identity is grounded in our communal identity, our common identity. I think that's important. So part of our image of God, part of that attribute is rooted in our common sharedness of being a human. And then I want to take a step from there and go into what Martin Luther King Jr. said, an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. So the idea that we all have the image of God within us, that when that is violated anywhere in the world, that is something that we should be maladjusted to, as Martin Luther King would say, something that we should always be maladjusted to, and work towards the coming of and the fulfillment of the reign of God, that one day there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, that one day God will wipe all our tears away, and that is a day that in the future will have fulfillment, and we today do not have here yet, but that we can still live in that reality prophetically, and that the world will not necessarily understand that completely, but that is important to live in that reality. So that's how I root the advocacy, Imago Dei, the Ubuntu, and then the idea that an injustice anywhere is an injustice. An injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere.
Let me try this. I think for me, a very simple question that I would ask is this. What do we believe is God's project in the world? It's a very simple question. In other words, when I begin to do theology, I want to know, okay, so what is God trying to accomplish in the world? Be it through the prophets, in Christ, in the preaching of Paul, what is God trying to do? And it seems to me that at least when I begin to answer that question, I want to begin by answering it in a corporate way. I want to begin talking about things such as the reconstitution of humanity. In other words, a part of what God is trying to do is bring humanity back into a good place. It's got to be something about the restoration of the world. It seems to me that inside of my own Protestant tradition, the temptation has always been to privatize religious experience. So therefore, the end result of my relationship with God is my salvation, my restoration, my moving into a place of well-being. And instead, what I want to begin talking about are corporate social things. So when Jesus talks about the kingdom of God, I wonder what he means if it isn't something corporate and social. Does he envision not simply a group of individuals who are going to make their way to heaven, but instead a new social reality? In other words, a new environment of men and women who are living together differently and who have a different effect on its world. They become salt and light to the rest of the world. The problem that has always been a part of my life is that when I begin talking like that, when I talk about the social or corporate implications of God's project in the world, my evangelical friends become anxious because they begin to ask me, are you sounding like a liberation theologian? Are you using the word justice, the J word? And if you're using the J word, that sounds to me like it's liberal. My great encouragement is that the generation of students that I have seen on this campus for the last 10 years are changing that answer. What is God's project in the world? In other words, I see a younger generation now coming through the ranks of Wheaton College who are saying, what God is accomplishing in this world is the restoration of things. Bringing the world, bringing creation back to that equilibrium it had at the beginning. That's amazing. That's wonderful. We are moving away from that individualism to something much more social. It's a good thing. I'm excited about that. So anyway, but I think the answer to your question, what is God's project in the world, is going to be the starting point for working out your theology of advocacy and justice.
All right, thank you. What I'd like to encourage you guys to do is to be thinking, if you have any questions, I'm going to ask maybe 2 more or so up here, and would love you to be thinking about your own. And we do have a couple mics here, so in about 15 minutes or so, I'm going to open it up to audience, all right? So if you've got anything going on in your own head, want to ask the question, write it down or something so you don't forget it, all right? So there was a recent article in Christianity Today written by one of the editors, Mark Galley, where he says, when huge poverty reduction strides have been made, it has been due not to every person doing their little part, but to government economists and bureaucrats making top-down macroeconomic decisions. Doing our little part makes very little difference when it comes to large-scale poverty. I think what Galli is afraid of is that if our primary motivation is to effectively change the world, then we are placing effectiveness before faithfulness, a little bit of what you mentioned, Adam, in simply loving those that God has put in our lives. Do you agree with this? Is there a difference between effectiveness and faithfulness, or the big macro-level issues and the small faithfulness issues? Do we need to distinguish between faithfulness to the hurting in our midst and effectiveness in shaping the macro-level issues? Are we powerless to shape the structures that impact the most vulnerable in our world?
There are a lot of questions in that. I think there absolutely is sometimes a difference between faithfulness and effectiveness. We believe in a God who is sovereign, who is all-powerful, who sent his son Jesus Christ to die on the cross in order to reconcile all things back to himself. We believe in a God who saves. We're not called to be the Savior. Jesus is the Savior. And so I think when we approach things like advocacy, the way I've always approached advocacy, especially when we're doing things and advocating for things that have very little human chance of success. For instance, what you're doing with Israel and Palestine, you face a lot of opposition in the church doing that. What I'm doing with climate change and other environmental justice issues, we face a lot of opposition in the church, and you've experienced that as well, Adam. So when we're up against issues that seem far too big for us, I think it's important. It's been really important for me, and it's been really life-giving for me to realize that I'm not called to save the planet. I'm not called to change the world. Jesus is already saving the planet. God is changing the world, and he will finish that. I'm called to faithfully represent him in whatever position he's put me in. So I think what James Davidson Hutter calls faithful presence is a very helpful way to think about what we're called to. We're called to faithfulness. We're called to fidelity, not efficacy. That said, being faithful usually entails being smart. And if there are ways that we can effectively change things, then we have a responsibility to do that. Being faithful doesn't mean we don't have to think about being effective. It just means that if we're ever faced with a choice where we are asked to compromise our means in order to achieve an end, we don't get to compromise our means. I think means are very important, and this is where politics goes wrong, honestly. This is where a lot of advocacy goes wrong, is in order to achieve a very worthwhile end, we compromise how we go about getting there. And in doing so, we give up our integrity. We get in bed with people who we shouldn't be in bed with, and we do things and say things that we shouldn't be doing and saying, and we lose our integrity. And once we lose our integrity, we're not reflecting Jesus Christ. We're taking on the responsibility for success. We're taking it from God, and we're putting it on ourselves. So I think we are called to be effective, and we should continue to find ways to do that. But we shouldn't sacrifice faithfulness. That does need to come first. But it's a both and I think most of the time we'll find that by being faithful, even from a worldly perspective, sometimes it looks like we're not having much success. It's amazing what the Holy Spirit will come and do. I ran a congressional campaign that everybody who knew anything about politics kind of thought, you are being ridiculous. What are you doing? What do you think you're doing? You have no money, you have no connections, you have no party backing, you have nothing. You're up against this really powerful incumbent with millions of dollars and a huge, powerful machine behind him. What are you doing? But we thought it was the right thing to do, and so we kept on it. And we were committed to being faithful, and we weren't afraid of losing. And you know what? We lost. But you know what? At the end of that campaign, I started hearing stories that I didn't hear during the campaign itself. People came to faith during the campaign. People actually found Jesus on the campaign trail because of what we were talking about, because of our advocacy for immigration reform and for energy reform that they thought the church was opposed to. And therefore, they couldn't bring themselves to even begin to think about a relationship with a God who didn't care for the immigrants, that didn't care about the planet. But once they saw that there were Christians who believed in a God that did care about these things, they were willing to take another look. And Some of them became Christians. And I tell you, honestly, some of them, here's a conversation before and after. Before, during the campaign, the first part, I had people come up to me and they said, I heard you graduated from Wheaton College. You're one of those evangelicals, aren't you? Well, guess what? We don't want you or any of your people anywhere near us in our party. Get out. And they actually mounted a legal challenge to try to kick me out. Well, at the end of the campaign, I had people come up to me, the same people come up to me and they said, hey, you know, now that we've had a chance to see what you guys are about and hear what you guys are trying to do and what you care about, we're really glad that you ran for us, and we're really glad that you stuck it out, because now we understand that to be a Christian, you can care about the poor. You can care about justice. And maybe that's a God I'd be interested in learning more about. Maybe that's a church I'd be interested in visiting. And so I don't think we get to measure effectiveness from our vantage point. I think we should be strategic about things, but we should pursue faithfulness, and we should trust. We have every right to trust in a God who brings fruit that we can't even see at the time from efforts that are faithful that, from a worldly perspective, might seem kind of silly or kind of Don Quixote-like.
I think Mark Galley's point here is that we do, when we encounter issues which are troubling, justice issues perhaps, there are little things you can do, and there are big things you can do. Mark argues, of course, that the little things really don't make any difference. Only the big things do when you affect the macro stage. To a certain extent, I think Mark has a fair point. I think we all start off, though, doing little things, and then it dawns on us that the effect you're having is sort of marginal, I guess, sometimes, but nevertheless, you're still being faithful. But I think it's a part of your own growth in relationship to that issue. In the early 90s, during the first Palestinian uprising, it occurred to me that an entire generation of Palestinians were actually forbidden for going to universities and colleges, because that's where all the trouble always was. So anyway, they were not being educated, and they ended up as manual laborers, and I knew a number of them. So in the early 90s, I started a scholarship program in Chicago that gave away one full-ride scholarship to a Palestinian Christian here in Chicago. Anyway, and that thing is still going on today. And I thought, well, that's a really pretty neat thing that we did. But then it dawned on me that really it was just one person being educated. It affected the economy of their entire family, I guess. But, was it really having an effect? And I think that for many of us, we're happy we did those small things, because that big list now of families has been affected, but the larger questions haven't been addressed. And so I think it moved from that to asking, okay, so is it possible to enter a larger forum? And the truth is, when you move to a larger forum, people start noticing. They think it's kind of interesting and perhaps kind of cute, charming maybe to have a scholarship program. But when you move to a larger forum, what I mean is speaking publicly at a denominational level, publishing an article, putting out a book, suddenly people notice and they begin to push back. So you move to that larger forum where you are making a difference, and you have to grow some tough skin, because people will not like what you do. And as soon as they begin, you take sort of, taking some shots, great, because that means you've been noticed. As somebody said to me once, you always know you're in the front line when you're getting kicked from the rear. Fantastic. Anyway, a good example of that is 2 years ago, I helped to organize a conference in Bethlehem, bringing together American and European Christian leaders as well as Palestinian Christian leaders, and we had about 250 people attend in Bethlehem, and it was a great moment. And we said to ourselves, wow, this is awesome. Maybe we can do this again in 2 years. Next week, we're going to go. I'm flying and taking 22 of our students to Bethlehem to attend it again, and we're thinking we're going to have about 500 this time in Bethlehem. That's an amazing thing. But the most exciting thing is that we're really annoying a lot of people. And that's great, because it means we're being noticed, and that's okay. But as one student said to me this morning in a class, hey, I hear that a Christian magazine has got Wheaton College in a leading article. And I said, whoa, that's great. What does it say? Wheaton College professor helping sponsor anti-Israel conference in Bethlehem. And I'm like, fantastic. Well, of course, that's a misrepresentation of what we're doing. What we're trying to do is encourage the Palestinian church and have that global conversation. But the thing is, we're getting noticed. And that's the thing. We are affecting that stage. But if you're going to move from the little things to the big things, there is always going to be pushback. But that's all right. I think you grow into that.
Gary is causing a ruckus. I can attest to that we're feeling that all the way on my end of what we're doing. What Mark said, big things need to come from little things. If I'm going to advocate for energy reform on a national level, I need to have my light bulbs changed to compact fluorescence. I need to switch off my lights. I need to drive more carefully. I need to do all those things. If I'm going to advocate for caring for the poor, or for public aid on a federal level, or even a state, whatever level it is, I need to know some people who are poor. I need to understand what they're going through, or either that or voluntarily become poor myself. So the little things really are important in order for us to be pursuing the bigger things.
I want to get back, faithfulness at efficacy. This question has been one of the things I'm still wrestling with, and I've been coming at this through late high school, early college, definitely from the faithfulness. Power is something that we cannot touch. It's not in the Christ narrative. Be very careful with it. Reading a little bit about liberation theology and also seeing some hard things in Honduras and talking to some people, I realized that God does care about some outcomes that happen in this world. I think one of the things that some theologies have recently brought in is that God is working in the world. God wants to see specific things happen in the world. He doesn't want starvation, for example. And God is working towards those things. So how do I be very faithful to what Christ calls us and the means I do that, but at the same time very much hold to, I want to see good things happen to this world that God deeply loves. Something I admire about the way ASJ does things, I think advocacy needs to be, I think like what Ben was talking about, really done smartly and well. Really good when it's done well, really bad when it's done poorly. And at ASJ we had weekly meetings to talk about, monthly meetings to talk about, these are the results we want, these are indicators of how we get those results. How are we meeting those? Accountability. I had weekly meetings. This is what you did this is what you said you were going to do last week. This is what you did last week. This is what you say you're going to do this week. So that means I'm always held accountable. We want we want to hold you to your thing. And people know in our hunger class, I'm all about get things done, do it well. I think efficacy is really important. Efficiency is really important, but at what point do you have to say let go and say I cannot control this. I cannot change. I think it's really important to have the humility that I think Ben was talking about, that we never have that savior complex, that idea that we can save the world at the very beginning, that we have to say that can't work. More of how can we participate, how can we learn. I think a lot of advocacy, as was being said, is listening to stories, and then saying, here's a story that I don't think, these people have a voice. People just aren't listening. There's no one voiceless in this world. There's just people who have voices that aren't being heard. And my voice, for some reason, is being heard. So I'm going to say, instead of using my voice, I'm going to say, this is a story I've heard. You should hear about this story. I think that's really good. And then regarding kind of the little things, big things, I have, I think structural things can be hit in a lot of different ways, and I think the way we are made and the personalities that we have means that there's there's many ways to live a good life, in the sense of a just life, a good life, and I think that can cross a number of different ways. I think advocacy actually has a lot of different forms, everywhere from researching how one species that has been brought in to one specific area, how that has been destructive, to all the way to what Dr. Burge and what Ben are doing, which is actually talking to the powers that be. So I think it has a range, and I think there's different ways to be an advocate.
Great. Well, I'd like to invite any of you with questions to come on up to the mic. As you do so, let me throw out one question, which is maybe thinking back on the Robert Putnam findings that I mentioned at the beginning, where they say that politics has polarized Americans, but they see a power latent within religious communities in America to unite. So how have you seen, or can you describe for us a time in your own advocacy where you have seen Christians from different, or maybe even non-Christians, from different political perspectives working together for justice, for a particular policy or cause? In other words, what sort of theological or biblical resources have you seen in practice being used to unite a politically polarized people?
I don't think anyone would deny that the Israeli-Palestinian issue, Ryan, is anything other than polarizing. You're either on one side of this one or on the other side of this one. And I think that what we've learned with all of the conferences we've done over time is that we end up just preaching to the choir. So we don't really, or we're not able to reach that other audience. You know, it's kind of like, Ben, you trying to reach the audience that really doesn't hear the environmental call that you want to make. Anyway, so I think that one of the things we've been thinking about and which is being implemented, I believe, at Willow Creek up in South Barrington under the leadership of Lynn Hybels, Bill Hybels' wife. Lynn has really said we want to change the vocabulary because what happens is that people react to the standard rhetoric of the problem. So who are the good guys, who are the bad guys? No, that's not the issue anymore. What we want to ask ourselves is how do we create a just and lasting peace for both sides? So what we've tried to do in our issue is let's avoid that polarizing and instead try to create a new vocabulary that is gets less reaction from either side. But that polarization that you described, Brian, it just sort of stops our conversation entirely. So we've got to move in a new direction.
I think immigration is a interesting point. What is being attempted here? I think typically it's a polarizing issue between the Democrats and the Republicans. But I've heard a friend of all of ours, I think Matt Sorens, is trying to bring this into, like, especially for evangelicals, this is an issue of welcoming the immigrant, welcoming stranger, and it's rooted in deeply biblical ideas that are found in Deuteronomy. Trying to find common narratives, common roots to these ideas. I think especially in cities that have a plurality of beliefs, it's hard to do that. But I think that's immigration, even though it's still a very polarized issue, I just see that as one example of an attempt at being made at trying to get across this polarization and to find like a common narrative, a common source of why this issue must be talked about and changed.
All right, any questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi. My question is, what role do you see institutions like Wheaton College playing in regards to advocacy, both, the stability of being an established institution, but then also the turnover of students coming in and out, and are we more of a training ground for sending people out to be involved in these things, or what can we do on the institutional level? Just how do you see all of that playing out? I don't know if that was clear.
I think we sometimes underestimate the significance of Wheaton College in the larger sort of scheme of Christian life in the United States. People really notice what happens here at Wheaton. And so when we sponsor a conference or we host people, that's a really significant thing. Here's an example. 2 years ago, there was a conversation out of Yale 2 years ago. It really was a conversation that spun off of 9/11, and it was called a Common Word conversation about Muslims and Christians actually talking to each other instead of bombing each other. It's a nice idea. Anyway, so Muslim-Christian dialogue went on quite a bit. But anyway, I was in that conversation, and there was a delegation of Muslim leaders, complete with the robes and beards. It was amazing. They were so cool looking. Anyway, they decided they wanted to come to America as a part of this conversation. They wanted to visit Christian universities. So they first wanted to go to Notre Dame. What? They wanted to go to Catholic University of America. Anyway, I saw the list, and I jumped on the list, and I said, whoa, are you kidding me? These guys are conservative Muslims. You guys are not going to find what corresponds to your world at Notre Dame. Trust me. Come to Wheaton College. It was amazing. So they changed their itinerary. The bus pulled up in front of Wheaton College. Do you remember this? This was so fantastic. Anyway, so we received them, and I had a group of select students get all dressed up, and we hosted them, and then we actually invited them to come to chapel. We were late. We made an entrance from the back of chapel. It was incredible, this parade of bearded men, and the students gave them a round of applause. And Chappie K said, we want to welcome you. You're from the Persian Gulf. They're Muslims. We welcome to our worship service. Those guys left Wheaton College saying, oh my gosh, we have learned that this is really a leading Christian institution in America, and look how we just got treated. So I think we dare not underestimate what little things like that do, because they lead to other really great things. So how can you say this with some humility? Wheaton College has a disproportionate influence on larger conversations around the country, and sometimes even internationally.
Ben, I'm wondering if you could say something about, I think maybe you helped shape some of the sort of changes even on campus that a lot of us take for granted nowadays, considering the foods and the LEED certifications. Maybe you could say something about that.
Yeah, sure. I think one way to think about an institution like Wheaton is to think about it as a greenhouse. Now, all analogies break down, so if it breaks down, just drop it where it breaks down, okay? But in terms of a greenhouse, we are a training facility. We constantly receive new seedlings and seeds, and we're in these artificial optimal conditions for growth and nurturing, and then we're sent out, and that's one of the roles we play. But the other thing is, if you want to know what's going to be planted in the fields come summer, you look at the greenhouses to see what they're growing. And a lot of the church looks at Wheaton College, and what they see here, they take their cues from us, and then the rest of the world takes their cues about what the church is about from us as well. So it's really important. I was at a conference recently with a gentleman named Bill McKibben, and I think he came to campus a few years ago and spoke a bunch. He's leading the global climate movement. It's called 350.org, and he was giving a keynote at a huge conference, and he was flipping up slides of all these global actions that were being taken to express people's concern for the planet all around the world. 180 countries. He was going through slide after slide after slide. And then he goes, and I want to pause a moment because this development has made me so excited. And he throws up a slide, a photo of a group of Wheaton students standing right in front of this stage, facing that way. And I go, I took that photo. And it was a group of Wheaton students for a 350 event that they had organized themselves, and I forgot what the event was called, but it was basically raising their voices around their concern about climate change. And he said, this is the first time I've seen the religious community engaging with the rest of the world and trying to protect the planet. And I don't know how many of you have heard of Wheaton College, but let me tell you about Wheaton College. And he just went on and on about Billy Graham and Beamer and all this other stuff about Wheaton College. And everybody was like, oh, Christians care, Christians care. But it was a photo of about 15 people, maybe 20 people, students at Wheaton, that somehow got into the hands of Bill McKibben. I don't know who gave him the photo. I didn't give him the photo. That changed the discussion for a few thousand people at a conference. So we do have an impact.
That's great.
So, excuse me. Dr. Burge, I know is going to have to head out to class in a minute or so, but we have about, he does work around here, so the rest of us are just going to hang out a little bit longer. We have about maybe 8 minutes, and I think maybe there's another question here, and so if Dr. Burge heads out, we'll know why. So.
Dr. Burge, you mentioned the significance of a conversion experience with regards to advocacy. The last 5 or 6 years now, I've occasionally found myself romanticizing, idealizing such an experience. I'd love to hear from each of you to what extent and in what ways you empathize with that romanticization, and then also any words of wisdom you have related to that.
Willie, so go back again, put your question in just short form. So it is,
Yes.
What do I think of people sort of wanting to have that kind of experience?
What do you think of that, and to what extent you've experienced that sort of imaginative idealization looking forward? Oh, I'd love to have that sort of experience where I walk up to those, IDF soldiers and whatnot. To what extent you empathize with that, each of you, and then any words of wisdom you'd have in light of your experiences with that sort of thinking.
Yeah, I'm not sure that you want to sort of, go into Sudan hoping you're going to run into Darfur and get into a firefight. I don't think you ought to do that. I think that you, I really want to believe that God is involved in this, Willie, and I think I want to believe that, as I want to go through life with an open heart, I want to go through life permeable. I think about it that way. And I think when that happens, I think suddenly I am accessible to the Spirit to help me to see things I would not have seen otherwise. So I think there's a temptation for us maybe to think, look, I want to find that place in the world. I want to have the most intense experience I can. Yeah, well, I mean, I think you want to have contact with what the problem is, but I don't think I necessarily want to go looking for the most dangerous place to experience it. I'm not sure that's it. Because actually some of those things can be really dangerous. I think though, Willie, let me just sort of, you asked about the trajectory and what this would mean. I think that it's almost, I imagine it as a muscle inside of my own life, and that somehow that muscle is usually atrophied for most of us. It's not used at all and it's very small. And I think when you have one encounter somewhere, the conversion experience, or you see injustice for the first time, what happens is that muscle comes alive. And when that muscle comes alive and it begins to grow and it begins being exercised on one issue, for me, the Palestinian issue, what happens is then I become sensitive and alert to other issues around the world. So in other words, a student talks to me, Lisa Judson talks to me about Congo. I don't know anything about Congo, frankly, but suddenly I begin seeing the same categories. Another student talks to me about Zambia, and I hear the same categories. In other words, I've got this sort of sensitivity. The antenna have grown. The muscle is strong. So I think, yeah, while I don't want to send you off, Willie, to dangerous places, my hope is that you would, at some point in your life, be so open to God's prompting that when you were in a context that was absolutely life-changing for you, that you would be able to receive it. Here's the funny thing, Willie. I have been with people who have been in parallel contexts to mine, and they've never seen a thing. Explain that to me. They have been exposed to the most incredible moments, and yet their lives were, I call it, not permeable, not open to change. So I think that's what has to happen. You have to be at a place of receptivity. Does that make sense?
All right, we have time for one more question, if anyone would like to jump in. Riley, great.
I think, I guess a lot of the stuff we've been talking about with advocacy has been specifically in a political realm. And I guess I was wondering, I'm looking personally to go to engineering school and be an engineer, and I know others are looking to become doctors, and nurses are working in the health profession. And I was just wondering, how can you have, how does advocacy have to be a political thing? And how do you have a voice for the voiceless when you're not, I guess when your occupation is not in the political sphere?
Advocacy absolutely doesn't have to be purely a political thing. I think, what we did when I was a student at Wheaton's campus, and you have a campus garden now, right? That was a result of advocacy, a successful advocacy. And I think it's just speaking up. I'm part of a new grassroots movement called Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. Our primary targets are the presidential candidates in this election. But you know who else we're trying to reach? We're trying to engage senior evangelical leaders who have been sitting on the fence or trying to hide from these issues and hoping not to have to be called out to get involved. So power is everywhere. And again, this comes back to how we interact with power and authority. But power is everywhere. And identifying where the power is concentrated or where it's at for different decisions that you're trying to reach, that's where advocacy should be going. So I think, yeah, it can be very broad.
There are many ways to live a just life, a good life. There are many ways to live a good life, and that can carry one into a lot of different fields. And I'm trying to say this to myself because I don't know where I'm going to be next year. So like where can I live justly? I mean, that can be in a number of different ways. I think that brings freedom to myself and to other people, that if one is not particularly inclined to get involved in what we would call the political realm, one can still be a part of kind of prophetic or being an advocate in a particular field.
That's actually perfect segue. It's actually a perfect segue into our next panel. But before I get to that, let me just put maybe on your radar, if you're interested to understand these things a little bit further, there's 2 books I would recommend. One is from a number of our very own professors of political science, international relations right here. It's called Church, State, and Citizen, Christian Approaches to Political Engagement, edited by Dr. Sandra Yorman. That's one. And the other one is by a British man named Graham Gordon. And he worked with Tier Fund for a long time, and actually with one of our hunger hosts, Paz y Esperanza, in Peru, for about 7 or 8 years in advocacy. The book is called What If You Got Involved? So two books I'd put on your radar. The next panel that we're going to have is starting in just about 10 minutes or so. And this panel is actually going to be on research, so this should answer your question, Riley. Other than sort of political engagement, another way to engage in advocacy is through research. And so we're going to be looking at that next. So for the next 10 minutes or so, I'll invite you to maybe browse the posters that we have in the back. All of the Return Hunger students have put a display together of what they were involved in during their hunger internships.
And if you're interested in continuing this particular conversation, the conversation will continue at a breakout session at 3:45 in the fireside room. Okay?
Great. All right, thanks.